Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Is everybody okay? Hopefully you had a nice lunch. Yes, thumbs up. Great. Good to see everyone. Welcome back for part 2 of our day-long symposium. I keep getting confused about whether it's emergent environments, environmental emergencies, or the other way around. But I think it works both ways, no? What's that? Well, we'll have to have a collective deliberation about that, which this might not be the right time for it. But anyway, what's that? I can't. What does it say? There you have it. Welcome back to part 2 of our afternoon on environmental emergencies, emergent environments. This is our panel on urbanization, and I will say a few brief words to explain what we have in mind. Urbanization is centrally implicated in the dynamics of climate change and in all kinds of socio-environmental transformations associated with modern capitalism, including all the ones that we've talked about thus far in the conference and many more. For this reason, obviously, urban studies are a central focal point for our work in SIGU, not only because cities matter, but because they have wide-ranging biogeophysical impacts on a planetary scale. We are, of course, concerned with cities and metropolitan regions as emergent zones of environmental transformation, crisis, and struggle, but just as importantly, we're interested in how spaces outside the city, in zones that are often described as rural, the countryside, the hinterland, the wilderness, and so forth, have been relentlessly transformed through their socio-metabolic relations to large population centers, which fundamentally mediate the remaking of territories, ecosystems, and habitats across the planet. In this sense, urbanization involves not only the growth and restructuring of cities and metropolitan regions, but a multi-scalar, crisis-riven, socio-environmental transformative process, what Marx famously referred to as a Stoffwechsel, a metabolism of matter, energy, and work, and politics, we should add. So emergence in our panel title, Emergent Environments of Urbanization, thus refers to the relational co-production of socio-environmental transformations within cities, as well as in their non-city zones of support and impact. So clearly, urbanization is today a flashpoint for scholarly and political debates on climate change and on planetary futures at all scales, and deciphering the role of cities as sites for the production of what Angelo has called urbanized natures requires considerable decoding in both theoretical and empirical, historical, concrete terms. And of course, there are urgent practical considerations in play, which we will also be engaging with here. How can we create more just, sustainable, environmentally viable, environmentally sane cities and forms of urban life unless we radically redesign the non-city spaces upon which they depend and to which they continually impact, or which they continuously impact. So in this sense, emergent urban environments are irreducibly local and planetary. They're both metropolitan and remote. Our panelists engage with such issues via a range of conceptual frameworks, and they have a variety of different substantive foci. All are among the leading thinkers who, in our view, are charting out new frameworks for understanding this set of issues, this problematique, across diverse spatial and historical contexts, and in relation to diverse intellectual and urgently political concerns. Their papers will offer us powerful inroads, openings into new lines of scholarship, including, importantly, theorizing, and they will, I expect, also offer us new horizons for practice and for struggle. So let me just briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll get started. So first of all, and this is the order in which we will present, Ihnji Jon is lecturer in human geography at the School of Geography and Planning at Cardiff University, where she explores how to link political ecology and environment planning with feminist relational approaches to identity, politics, and space. Her first book is Cities in the Anthropocene, New Ecology and New Urban Politics, published a couple years ago with Pluto. We'll then hear from Angelo, who is currently Associate Professor of Sociology at UC Santa Cruz and current member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Hillary's work offers a social theoretical perspective on socio-ecological questions through historical and contemporary research on urban greening, sustainability planning and policy, infrastructure and climate change. Hillary's first book, award-winning first book, is How Green Became Good, Urbanized Nature and the Making of Cities and Citizens, which was published just a couple years ago by University of Chicago Press. Last but not least, Billy Fleming is the founding Wilkes Family Director of the Ian L. McHarg Center for Urbanism and Ecology at Penn, the Weitzman School of Design. He is co-founder of the Climate and Community Project, a climate justice think tank dedicated to connecting movement demands and progressive legislators through applied researcher. And he's also co-creator of the organization Data Refuge, an international initiative to secure critical environmental data at risk of erasure during the Trump administration. Billy's work includes recent co-authored or co-edited books, including A Blueprint for Coastal Adaptation, published with Island Press a couple years ago, and Design with Nature Now, published by Columbia University Press also a couple years ago. So first up is Ihnji Jon. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you so much, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Nira and Savina, for inviting me. It's an honor to be here and with Hillary and Billy. So my talk today is called Bubble Clash, Seagulls, Waste, and Challenges of Environmental Justice in a Multicultural Suburb. And I think environmental justice seems to be really the topic of our generation. We are concerned about the future of our planet, but we are also equally concerned about the unequal impacts of rapidly unfolding environmental degradation that affects our everyday lives. So in this short presentation, I want to invite you to the research journey that I've undertaken in a multicultural suburb called Dandenong. So Dandenong is about an hour away from Melbourne. You will see here Dandenong, and Melbourne is here. And so I hope to show you how the story of Dandenong helps us think about what we mean by justice when we talk about justice. And I hope to convey the message about how justice is not just a predetermined moral principle, but a topic of our ongoing conversation about a political situation that demands genealogical analysis. So when I was living in Melbourne a few years ago, I took a train about an hour to visit Dandenong. And this is a multicultural suburb, 30 kilometers away from Melbourne. And the city of Dandenong claims itself to be a city of opportunity because it has welcomed a lot of refugee settlements as a part of their economic revitalization strategy since the early 2000s. So it used to be a struggling post-industrial suburb with a rapid population decrease, but like a lot of suburbs and small towns in the US right now, Dandenong used the welcoming city as a strategy to attract more people that would make up of the mainstream economy. So Dandenong city center is now home to Afghan precincts as well as Little India. And basically these little pockets of streets packed with small restaurants and specialty groceries and other shops selling culturally specific products. But since 2011, they've been going through a so-called bird problem due to a sudden increase in seagull population. And I don't know if I can play a video here. So this is a video. I don't know if there is a sound. Yeah, so the video, I don't think it really does justice because there are a lot of seagulls basically, and it's very loud. And so the property owners around this area have been complaining to the city that the birds' droppings and the new nests in the gutter are harming the properties and also property values. So they are asking the city to cull them, which means like kill some of them. So there have been speculations around whether this may be related to the city's multicultural populations. And it's true that some migrant households and market vendors, and I saw them really in person, like believing in human, non-human cohabitation as positive for cultural and other religious reasons, intentionally feed the birds or treat food scraps differently in a way that is very inviting to the seagulls. But on the other hand, it is also suspected that one of the key sources of bird attraction comes from several landfill sites nearby that serve wider metropolitan area, and this is rendered possible by the cheaper land value and the distance from the Melbourne CBD. And so I was initially trying to analyze this problematic situation through the angle of feminist philosophy and epistemic justice. And I was drawing a lot from Patricia Hill Collins, who discussed the political contestation across heterodox knowledge programs and how more powerful or dominating knowledge paradigms often impose a particular worldview, such as the one that prioritizes property values. So then the scholarly debates on epistemic justice really made sense in the case of Dandenong in terms of how property owners and city councilors trying to kill the seagulls to protect what they see as valuable, and also trying to penalize the residents for giving food to birds. And at the same time, how mostly non-Anglophone communities considered seagulls as God's creatures and considered killing them as inhumane. But obviously, what's also very clear here is the question of distributive justice. So waste facilities are clearly concentrated in Dandenong because Dandenong is further away from their higher rent areas, but these facilities in Dandenong are serving wider and richer suburbs in metropolitan area. So Dandenong currently hosts 3 landfills, 4 organic waste processing and composting factories, and 12 industrial waste management and 1 abattoir. And if you go into this area, the smell is really overwhelming. So in addition, the nearby suburbs were previously home to these landfills, but they breached the landfill gas limit in 2016, so they had to close. So these are the remaining sites there. So basically, Dandenong area is handling a lot of landfill waste coming from other areas, and which was one of the reasons why seagulls were taking roots in the area. And this may be related to classic case of environmental justice, where the migrant groups unfairly ended up in the landfills with the landfills that serve wider metropolitan area and currently going through environmental issues, including sudden increase of seagulls. But what makes these matters of justice more complicated, I think, is the fact that industrial land use zoning, which is why more waste facilities are concentrated there, is also benefiting the Dandenong's economy as it creates employment opportunities like food processing factories, especially those who start their livelihoods from scratch. And remember that Dandenong is a welcoming city that tried to make economy out of newly arriving populations, right? So I think there are 3 key issues here that constitute the politics of environment justice. First of all, there's a broader cultural dynamics. So there are different perceptions of environment and interaction with the modern human worlds. And secondly, obviously, the political economy land, which is central to this discussion, the waste disposal distribution issues resulting from capitalist land economy, and lower rent areas becoming the waste receiver communities as opposed to higher rent areas remaining as waste sender communities. And finally, everyday materialities regarding new communities and their livelihood concerns. I think my interaction with the residents only made it clear to me that a lot of residents were preoccupied with livelihood concerns such as paying bills and their bumpy social integration to the new country. And more than 60% are foreign-born populations, whereas the only medium here is English language. So basically, what does the story of Dandenong tell us about environment justice? I think it's the fact that the environment justice issues are very, very complicated. And because there are so many issues that are tangled up in relation with one another, I find it useful to focus on a particular problematic situation in a specific time and place, and trace that history of the problematic situation in terms of why it had to unfold or unroll the way it did, so as to think about what could have been done otherwise. So let's say the problematic situation here is 2023, Dandenong, where waste facilities are concentrated, and this has resulted in a dispute over the seagull invasion. And the genealogical approach that reassembles the past from the viewpoint of this problematic situation can result in the following discussion. First of all, we have to think about the production of waste. So we have to think about how the amount of waste ending up in these lower rent suburbs and how that's inseparable from our consumption culture and the eternal growth mentality. So environment justice problem, in essence, expresses a conflict between community interests versus the needs of the capital. The waste management facilities are rightly needed in the service of metropolitan growth, and typically in the hands of capital-state relationship. And at the same time, waste receiver community, like Dandenong, doesn't really have a say in the production of environmental problems or the state's capital investment decisions. But second, relatedly, we can also pay attention to the historic processes of top-down planning in Melbourne. So in Melbourne metropolitan area, where the Dandenong belongs to as a municipal government, and the state is Victoria, right? The state government, the state of Victoria, has the final say in land use decisions. So citizens have been repeatedly complaining to the state government that they don't really want this industrial land use anymore because they've been there for decades. But then the state government didn't really want to change it because they need that for the entire metropolitan growth. But I think also important is the modernity and the dualistic economy between clean communities versus waste-deserving communities. So in our modern society, the garbage problem is often a public nuisance problem or health and sanitation problem that requires scientific expertise. And in framing so, we often forget about the question of how we define garbage or normalize or naturalize clean spaces that are off limits to garbage versus disposal spaces where technological innovativeness like waste to energy facilities legitimize the level of waste being dumped onto these waste receiving communities, which are lower rent areas. So you see here, the city of Melbourne boasts its promise to restore green areas. At the same time, the communities like Dandenong still have to deal with the state-mandated industrial land use zoning that serves as a sewer of capitalist growth. And I think I didn't really list it here, but what's also important is the modernity and the definition of good life, right? So clearly in the regional growth visions of Melbourne metropolitan area, they see welcoming cities or welcoming refugee settlements as a furnishing human labor to capitalist regional growth. And this is obviously undergirded by liberal welfare economics, idealization of particular version of good life. So in today's world where property ownership and stable revenue streams define the geographies of order, feeding birds is an irrational behavior subject to corrective control, especially because they disrupt the lifespan of properties and their values. So what can we take away from all of this? I think this case reminds us of the fact that environment justice is an ongoing political situation that finds itself in an interactive dynamics between cultural politics, political economy of land, and also everyday material affordances. And in the middle of these complications, a genealogical approach allows us to reassemble the history of problematic situations, specifically with the intention to ameliorate the physical conditions of subjection. And finally, I think related to our conference title, The Emergent Environments, is the phenomenon of bubble clash. So unexpected accidental events, such as that of a Seagull invasion, often mandates a almost forced interaction between different reality bubbles, reminding us of the interdependency and relationality as the inescapable condition of our physical cohabitation, which is very much of a characteristic of an urban condition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ihnji. Next up is Hillary Angelo.
There we go. Okay. Am I speaking in this microphone? Sorry, just one last thing. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Neil and Sigu, for organizing this and for having me today. I think everyone's been saying this, but I have not been this excited to attend a conference in a really long time. So it's really a pleasure to be part of it. Since we don't all know each other here, and since I am also going to be presenting on very new work, I wanted to start just talking a little bit about myself. So I, for those of you who don't know me, am an urban and environmental sociologist. And much of my work has examined the durability of old environmental ideas for solving new social problems and their consequences for urban planning and policy. So a sort of basic finding of much of my work has been that in contemporary sustainability planning and policy, old ideas of external green forms of nature as a good for society remain the kind of dominant vision of climate-friendly urbanism. And this is, of course, despite the negligible or regressive impacts of some of these interventions, and despite them being often ill-suited for the problems they purport to solve. So tree planting initiatives are a primary example of this, which several people have talked about already. So now I'm at the beginning of a new project that moves from sort of sites of urban concentration to extended urban landscapes and also to questions of change. So given that climate change is understood to require a fundamental transformation in human relationships to the environment, the big question my research has raised for me is where and to what extent are alternative environmental ideas being taken up and drawn on as a resource in response to climate crisis. So that's the context for and the questions that motivated the project I'm going to talk about today. So I came to this work through a specific set of epistemological questions about understandings of society and nature. But as a sociologist, I'm also, or sort of more fundamentally, interested in climate change as a form of large-scale social transformation. And in particular, the question of how we change everything in the context of the inertia of existing systems and the durability of existing arrangements. So capitalism is, of course, a primary one, but also built environment itself, right? Cities that grew near deep ports and waterways, highways, suburbs, as well as legal and bureaucratic infrastructures. So in essence, I'm wondering about, or trying to ask questions about the possibility of transformation as we transition, right? And I've been doing research on people's attempts to do things differently by intervening in these systems, asking where and why do their attempts succeed or fail, and why not. So today I'm going to talk about one piece of this project, which is related to renewable energy development in the American West, highlighting its urban dimensions. So I will very briefly describe the case, the warrant for a kind of urban analytic here, talk a bit about the 19th and 20th century patterns as a way to understand the landscape in which people are operating today and what it means to change it, and then turn to contemporary energy development and the politics surrounding it in 15 minutes, I promise. So the main points I hope to communicate are, this is a moment of transformation in infrastructure in which the underappreciated relationality of land and energy issues is becoming especially problematic. And what it prevents us from seeing are the ways in which old patterns are being repeated in new systems we're building out, and how the structure of public discussion reflects these spatial relations. So first, the case. So the place I've gone to think about these issues is the American West, because for the past 150 years, it has been paradigmatic of modernist ideas of the domination of nature, and of nature as outside of society, of the paradigm that climate change, in theory, is forcing us to break away from, as massive infrastructure projects were pursued in tandem with the preservation of pristine wilderness in the form of national parks. So now, of course, these old systems are in crisis. Hydropower is failing, reservoirs and rivers are running dry, coal-fired power plants are being shuttered. And as, across the West, a new energy system is being built out, these sites are becoming a nexus of struggles over alternatives. Oops. So the terrain on which much of this is playing out are what are known as public lands. So I'm going to gloss over the history of dispossession of which these lands are a product, but let's just say that today the federal government still manages a quarter of the land in this country, and the vast majority of that, fully 1 in 10 acres of land in the United States, are arid deserts and grasslands explicitly held as public domain managed by the Bureau of Land Management under a multiple use mandate. And these lands have become extremely important as old extractive uses decline and new ones are built out. So public lands are currently responsible for 23% of US emissions as a result of oil and gas leases. And the Biden administration recently described them as engines of renewable energy development. So this is the site where I've gone to think about this question of transition versus transformation, where and to what extent people have been able to do things differently in the context of current needs and pressures, such as those related to the build out of renewable energy. Okay. So this is a panel about urbanization. So what I'm going to say now won't surprise you. It certainly won't surprise Neil. These are deeply relational geographies. In 1934, the historian and essayist Bernard DeVoto described the West as the plundered province of eastern cities, just as it's part of the rise of the larger West as the seat of global American empire. But that this story about the West and its development is a story of urbanization is still underappreciated. Right? These connections have often been mystified and attenuated. So in scholarship, Just as sociologists of modernity were able to examine social life in the metropole without consideration of its relationship to the colonies, urbanists have studied cities without their hinterlands. While, as several members of this conference have told us, there's a pervasive metronormativity of urban climate movements and policymakers, where kind of rural and agrarian populations become a problem for decarbonization that must be solved. And there's also an unevenness in these relationships. So much like actual colonial relationships, it's sort of like a one-way mirror. It's the best image I've come up with to talk about this. So the historian Andrew Needham argued of a coal-fired power plant in the Four Corners region of the US that while the relationship between urban development and Navajo underdevelopment was very clear from the hinterland, these relations were obscured in cities. Rural communities living with these infrastructures thought all the time about energy and where it went and its local impacts, while metropolitan consumers might never have to think about where their energy comes from. So there is a need for a synthetic relational view now as we are transforming these systems. Okay, 3, what does this landscape look like? So I'm going to very briefly describe this field in which people are operating to try to characterize the kind of durable shape of the past epoch or of this epoch to understand what it means to repeat these patterns or to change them and do things differently. So this is a sort of canonical periodization of US Western development, trying to put the city and infrastructure at the center. So we can think about the 19th century in the United States as a century of expansion. So as there was the kind of epistemological construction of Western land as empty and expropriatable, and the construction of large networked infrastructure, like the railroad, most paradigmatically, to actually facilitate that settlement and expropriation. This helped create and sustain specific spatial and social relations, an understanding of the city as society versus the hinterland as nature, a kind of linear metabolism or metabolic rift, things we're still living with today. The 20th century we can think of as the century of reclamation, right? So this is the Bureau of Reclamation, was doing big projects mostly related to water infrastructure, dams, hydroelectric power, that sort of thing. These projects famously rationalized nature. They facilitated, for among other things, irrigation to allow large-scale agriculture to feed growing cities, and water to sustain growing populations. So more precisely, across these 2+ centuries, I think we might say that infrastructure development, extending also to energy infrastructure, took the following form. So the political economy is a mode of infrastructure as development, where the federal government lowers barriers to private capital and provides huge gifts of public land to support private development. The shape is centralized, networked, and large scale, and the epistemology is a binary one of external nature that is either instrumentalized for the best human use or preserved as wilderness playgrounds. And this model was institutionalized, for example, in energy and utility companies and in the infrastructure of power grids and transmission lines. And that infrastructure itself helped create and maintain these kinds of city-hinterland relations, right? Facilitating the movement of goods into cities and disposal of waste beyond them, while at the same time its mediation obscured those relationships, as many people have argued. Okay, so against that background, we might christen the 21st century as that of adaptation, right? We're at this moment of massive investment in infrastructure in a new context. And so again, the question for me has become, are we repeating or are we changing these institutional, spatial, and political patterns? So the energy transition implies, among other things, a shift from the use of energy-dense buried sunlight, literally accessed through a hole in the ground, to horizontal, more land-use intensive geography of renewables, mostly in rural areas. But also new energy sources with new affordances that, in theory, at least make different shapes possible, right? So we can put solar panels on rooftops as well as other places. And this is all happening in a new social context and amidst a reevaluation of these lands and their uses and an interest in kind of different epistemologies and understandings of natural environments across country and city. So beyond the most obvious relationship of urban consumption to the development of renewable energy on public lands, there are other contemporary relational pressures on these areas, which include a huge increase in the use of public lands for cheap, COVID-safe recreation, which quite interestingly also happened during the Great Depression. Second, in the context of Black Lives Matter, pipeline protests, and so on, an interest in the land back movement and new arguments for sovereignty and new models of co-stewardship. And as in response to urban housing crisis, the increasing use of public lands for formal and informal affordable housing. So people are living on public lands as a solution to housing insecurity. So given all this, what's actually happening? So I've been doing fieldwork for about the past 18 months, looking at utility scale solar development in the Nevada desert in areas like this one, where critics, who include conservation biologists, local residents, and tribes, argue that old patterns are being repeated in the current use of public lands for energy. Specifically in terms of the Euro-American disregard for arid lands, or the use of a desert as a sacrifice zone, a colonial relationship of cities to extractive hinterlands, the government support of private development with land subsidies, and this kind of metropolitan development and local underdevelopment. And they see this happening in the absence of discussions about alternatives, such as reducing consumption, changing distributions of benefits, making different decisions about land use and environmental value in the context of things like biodiversity and extinction crises. And I've come to think that their analysis is correct, and more to the point for me, is resulting in the repetition of the same pattern as the last epoch. So you remember I said that sort of 19th and 20th century infrastructure had a distinct political economy, shape, epistemology instead of urban-rural relations. And despite the very different affordances of solar, I think we're seeing renewable energy development pursued in the US in this same model of the government lowering support for private development, of centralized generation and long-distance transmission, and of a binary understanding of society and nature, where again, the options are only preserve wild nature or instrumentalize it for the best human use. There are a lot of reasons why this is happening that I'm not going to talk about here, but they basically boil down, I think, to the path dependencies of these existing material and institutional structures, especially in the context of urgency, right, where it's easier to kind of go along these paths rather than laying new ones. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up now by returning to the politics and specifically the structure of the public discussion of these issues that also has an urban-rural dimension. So what's been really interesting to me is that this is a left critique of renewable energy development, right? So the people I've been working with have been resisting decarbonization in the form of green capitalism, green colonialism, or extractivism. The substance of their critique is that we are failing to break from the old model, right? That we're decarbonizing without significantly changing the political economy of energy or making different choices about land use in light of current environmental and social concerns. In other words, they are trying to make an argument for transformation, not just transition, and they're essentially calling on us to decommodify and decolonize as we decarbonize. But with few exceptions, they have absolutely failed to articulate this point in a way that makes any sense to mainstream environmental organizations or that facilitates alliance building with urban social movements or climate justice groups, even though, as I said, urbanites are sort of relying on these spaces for all kinds of reasons. And I think this is because in the US, energy politics are basically discussed in two ways. So in terms of private property rights versus the public good, or the political economy of distributed versus utility scale. And the objections of the communities I've been working with have, for the most part, been understood within these frames, with protesters dismissed as regressive NIMBYs or as climate deniers, even by environmental organizations, even and especially, I should say, by environmental organizations. But beyond these two questions, the spatiality of renewables in the US, the fact that a significant percentage of renewable energy development will take place on public lands and waters, also raises a different set of questions about land rights, the commons, and stewardship and the public trust. And this means that questions involve not just the right of individuals to protect their own interests or who pays and who benefits from structural change, but a commons question: what to do with this land in the context of competing claims and uses and various possible futures. And what I think is quite interesting is that in other places, there's a totally different vocabulary for understanding these conflicts, right? So we discuss energy grabbing in India and elsewhere. Agrarian studies scholars, mostly looking at the global south, kind of talk about this in very different terms. And I want to make a plug for Joe Gouldy's work here and say that in this context where renewable energy development is happening on public land and at a moment of collective reappraisal of this commons, I think this development should also be understood as kind of de facto decision-making about the public trust, in which the state, in facilitating this development, is playing a role as an arbiter of public space as well as public works. But anyway, the point here is not to prescribe a specific political vocabulary or romanticize rural America, obviously a very complex place, but to point out that this kind of language or perspective is almost completely absent from the American public discussion of renewable energy siting or development and scholarly work on these issues. And I think the fact that it isn't talked about in these terms reflects how little awareness urban coastal policymakers have of these Western landscapes, which is in part a legacy of this infrastructure of modernity and the spatial organization of its energy geographies. Last statement. So to return to the question of whether we're repeating or changing the patterns of infrastructural modernity, urban rural that are currently in ways that inhibit coalition building across urban and rural space and potentially more progressive trajectories of social change. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Hillary. Last but not least, Billy Fleming.
All right, let me see if this thing works. Okay. You can hear me okay? Cool. I'll very quickly echo everyone's praise. This is such a gift to be here with you all these couple of days. I don't think I've seen you in like 4 years, Neil, so this is like such a lovely treat to be back with you. And there'll be little bits and bops, some of them enumerated, some of them implied, of work from folks like Holly, from Shannon, from Josh, who I've never even met before, but your work has been incredibly important to my own work. And so being able to be here with you all is such a treat. So I'm gonna do a couple of things. I'm not gonna talk about cities that much, sorry, Neil, but I am gonna talk about some other stuff. I'm gonna do a bit of like contextual things to kind of give you a sense of the container in which I think about some of the built environment's sort of relationship to this conversation working. And then I'll talk about some of the other projects I've been able to work on the last couple of years. I think it's important to just begin to maybe pick up the thread Holly sort of pulled for us yesterday around pathways, emissions pathways, right? So thinking about things like path dependency and infrastructure lock-in. These are not just social, they obviously have like social relational components to them, but the literal physical manifestation of infrastructure projects, whether we're talking about water management, whether we're talking about carbon management or electricity, these are things that are literally built into the physical world, doing so because of the financial structure, the political and institutional structure that underpins their capital investment and their operations and management. Every one of those we build has a 30 to 50 year sort of operational timeline. I think Holly mentioned yesterday some of the projects coming online that are indexed towards some of the 2030 and 50 emissions goals. Those are being planned now because to build anything in this country is a minimum of 3 years, usually more like 10 or 12. And once they're built, because they're so time and capital intensive, we've structured all of our financial instruments and all of our sort of tax instruments to allow companies to operate them as long as possible. It's how you get refineries like the one that exploded in Philadelphia a couple of years ago, being allowed to operate in the way that they are, because building these things takes so long that we give companies lots of leeway to continue operating unsafe facilities. This is where stranded assets as an idea sort of comes from. And I want to pick up one other thread. I stole this idea a little bit from Shannon, who was editing slides until her talk, so I decided to do the same. So threw in a lovely slide here from one of my, or a paper here from one of my colleagues, Thea Riofrancos, whose work was mentioned also yesterday in a lithium report that I'll talk a little bit about at the end as well. But this idea of offshoring is in some ways around the energy transition being inverted. There's a very explicit effort by both the Biden administration and the European Union to onshore the mining, the waste disposal, the manufacturing, the technological deployment, not for reasons of climate or environmental justice, but for supply chain security and energy management. Thea, this is a paper of hers you should all check out, but it's part of a longer book project she's about to finish, I think. So where built-in designers, architects, landscape architects, urban planners tend to interact with these sets of conversations tend to come across in sort of two poles. One of those is very abstract. So thinking through, I'm guilty of this too, using images like this of interconnected planetary systems to tell stories that are much larger than the object we're commissioned to work on. This is a project I worked on with a team of folks a few years ago called an Atlas for the Green New Deal, developed with a bunch of climate justice sort of organizational leaders over a couple of years, but did a version of this there. The sort of pixelated representation you see there is meant to sort of reflect uncertainty, but what it's showing you is, in a sort of notional way, the amount of land area that an all sort of tree-based carbon sequestration plan might require of us. For an entirely sort of solar or wind, sort of all renewables plan, what that might demand of us in terms of land area. And that's just generation, that's not storage, that's not transmission, that's not extraction, it's not all of the other things. And these are, again, just sort of like notional conversation starting images as a part of that project. One that I've tended to fall into in terms of abstraction. The other sort of pole tends to be around hyper precision. So this idea that we can and will model and understand every single molecule in the world and manage it. It's this idea in some ways that's embedded in architecture that people might understand something like the energy transition or the climate crisis through molecules in the atmosphere. We'll walk outside one day and know it's a low carbon day. I don't know if that's going to be true. Or we'll power up a computer like we are today and have some material, visceral sort of understanding that it's powered by wind or solar instead of coal or gas. And those things aren't true. But anyway, lots of my colleagues are now very invested in this idea that the central role for architects, landscape architects in this sort of conversation is to be better material specifiers, to just spec non-petrochemical building materials, spec carbon sinking landscapes that we're not sure will actually sequester carbon at any real-time scale that matters, or geologic scale or geographic scale that matters. It gives you very complicated images like this from Pathfinder that a lot of my friends are working on. Super interesting, useful tools for near-term practice, not going to do many of the things they're being promised to do. Instead, for me, I tend to think about this like archipelago of sites. Shannon's laughing because I think one of her students is on here with me, Zane Griffin-Telly-Cooper, lots of other people. This is an image, an illustrative image of what a supply matrix for a lithium-ion battery could look like, right? This is not a precise tool. But it's meant to sort of stitch together this archipelago of sites of extraction, of waste disposal, of transportation and logistics, of manufacturing, and of end-use technological deployment, and perhaps post-use sort of e-waste disposal that are bound up in a single battery. And is in here in part because this is drawing very heavily from Zane's work, but also from folks like Keller Easterling, who recently wrote a book about many things, including supply matrices. As a conceptual and managerial tool, the supply chain emerged in the 90s and remains the foremost method for thinking about the movement of materials, labor, products, and other commodities. But those supply chains only appear to work as well as they do because of strategic gaps in our knowledge about them. This is much of how the carbon management sort of system works as well. These gaps show that this way of imagining and managing the supply chain bears little resemblance to its actually existing forms, of which this is just a very small collection of them, right? And when we think about where the terrain of contestation around the energy transition and climate justice are being made and remade, it's around this archipelago of sites in which the material movement of the various bits of energy and digital technology we're going to need are coming from, moving through, and being deployed in. Spatially, this has profound implications for the energy system and the physical and social sort of relations of the United States. This is from a report that Holly mentioned yesterday, Net Zero America, from folks at Princeton. The report is kind of a problem in some ways, but it's also the framework the Biden administration is using in some ways for the implementation side of IIJA and IRA, the infrastructure and climate bills. So it's useful for us to at least think of as kind of a framework we're going to have to be familiar with because for better or worse, it's coming. It has lots of things in here that are interesting to sort of poke through, things that I use in studio teaching with students often, giving us a sense of at least like magnitudely or directionally, what's the scale and scope of land and landscape transformation that some of these different energy transition goals might require. I'm not going to go through this like full list here. It was just in Missouri. So as you can see, Missouri is like kind of center on both of those sides there, one of the most heavily impacted sort of places in the country when it comes to solar and wind deployment. Some of this work is part of a new book project, which is the same title as the talk, Building Post-Carbon Futures, divided into kind of like 4 sections. One of those is historiographic and asking questions about sort of state-led moments of land and built environment transformation. But there's a centerfolio of projects there that are meant to sort of capture and document and contextualize the kinds of things that Green New Dealers, climate justice advocates, and others say they want to build. What's this world going to look like that we've been proposing and fighting for? This is one particularly bleak version of that. This is the Ningxia agrivoltaics project in Western China. It's both an anti-desertification project and an agrivoltaics project. So if you don't know agrivoltaics, we can talk about it in the Q&A, but basically you can produce energy and food there. The food production is actually much more efficient because of some of the gains you get from the solar panels. This is Orca on the left, the sort of Icelandic CDR project, one of the first sort of successful commercial CDR projects that isn't used for enhanced oil recovery, which is what the one you see on the right is used for there. Many different forms of CDR tech out there that folks like Holly can give you much more information on, but it is important to distinguish here, right, between like carbon capture and sequestration and some of the other versions of this we'll see out in the world. And then, one of the other projects that gets highlighted in there is these couple. One's a transmission project in the bottom right. One is a geothermal district level plan on the left. These are part of Canada's sort of energy transition work, which is imperfect but really interesting. They're in this post-truth and reconciliation moment where they're beginning to implement some of the things that were codified as a part of that process, which includes First Nation ownership of at least 51% of the benefits of every one of these projects that comes online. Doesn't matter if it's hydrogen, doesn't matter if it's geothermal, doesn't matter if it's something else. And many of them are owned outright by tribes. So a very interesting bit of work that's underway now just north of us here in Chicago. And then this is another one I won't spend too much time on. This is a pumped hydro storage project called Raccoon Mountain. If you don't know pumped hydro storage, one use for this is taking abandoned mines in a place like, let's say, Central Appalachia that we can't figure out other uses for, perhaps because they're too toxic or too isolated from other folks. So we can use moments of excess wind generation to pump water uphill into the mine. And at night, maybe when the wind's not blowing as much or during the day, we can let it flow down and spin turbines to power us in a very low-tech version of a battery. These are just some of the ways that the landscape of the U.S. is being transformed and will be transformed through the energy transition. It's not even getting into all of the movement of people as sea levels rise and people are literally forced to relocate. This is work from Matt Hauer's sort of modeling. Matt's a climate geographer at Florida State, the first person in the U.S. to really go in and count up how many structures will literally be inundated under the different sea level rise scenarios, to append that to a demographic model of where they're likeliest to move. And because we live in a country that's run by market fundamentalists, you can see they're moving from one very vulnerable place to another. If you haven't seen this, and so some of these things, so thinking about the build out of all of this stuff, we're basically asking ourselves to build the most infrastructure we've probably ever built in this country, as fast and as well as we've ever built anything. The larger energy system we built over the course of a century and a half, mostly completely deregulated. We're asking ourselves to do 3 to 10 times that amount of work in a much shorter time scale, which is going to require a lot of A&E firms that are problematic to be involved in this work. This is an incredible report from the Buell Center a couple of years ago. I'm just gonna leave it up here so you can come back to it if you'd like to. But gets into I think Holly mentioned yesterday a couple of times some of Femi Taiwo's work, which for lots of reasons has been important to my own. But in it, in one of his books, Femi writes like a book every 6 months. He wrote what's essentially a sort of a challenge for built environment professionals in a book about climate justice and philosophy. Injustice and oppression are global in scale. Why? Because transatlantic slavery and colonialism built the world we live in, and slavery and colonialism were unjust and oppressive. If we want reparations, we should be thinking more broadly about how to remake the world system. And that presents a problem for designers because most of procurement of large-scale federal projects in the US, the procurement rules are stacked towards large multidisciplinary practices who build, among other things, jails. This is AECOM's justice vertical in their portfolio. They build oil infrastructure, including headquarters for fossil majors. This is HOK, Abu Dhabi's national oil headquarters. Even our own in landscape architecture, Martha Schwartz, who I admire for the way she's brought climate into the discourse of landscape architecture, has nevertheless run a firm that's been building projects that have been labeled eco-apartheid projects by locals in places like UAE. You can see here this weird representation of Rachel McAdams drinking a very expensive glass of wine in a fuchsia bubble, probably built with enslaved labor in the UAE. And if we look at where, this is like the kind of conversation that I usually have in a room full of architects who, when you mention the word anti-capitalism, they transform into Joseph McCarthy. But basically architecture, landscape architecture are classified in all forms of industrial classification as a professional service. Doesn't matter if we're talking about NAICS, doesn't matter if we're talking about SIX, these are North American and standard industrial classification. We go where capital flows, just like McKinsey, just like KPMG, just like any other management consulting out there in the world. Treating it like it's special and different allows us to exploit all of our workers, but doesn't actually address any of those big gaps. This is a map showing what looks like light pollution. That's just global regional product, a measure of wealth, basically. And the purple hubs you see are the headquarters of the 100 largest A&E firms in the world, and the spokes are all of their listed projects on their sites. And this is just a way for us to show, for me to show, design expertise goes where capital flows, and most of the front lines of the climate crisis are not in those zones. So if we're serious about wanting to be useful to these movements, useful to these questions, we have to find other models of practice that are not predicated on that. And Doug's here. Doug, you can wave your hands around if you want, but Doug's one of the most, I think, forceful sort of critics of this kind of work, and has, I think, pointed me in all kinds of fruitful directions over the years as well. I won't read that because we're getting close on time.
Read it. Read it.
Oh, okay.
I think we should dwell on it, yeah.
Doug writes, while architects and architectural theorists have generally been less brazen than Patrick Schumacher about their enthusiasms for the subsumption of the urban and architectural orders to those of the market, they have tended since at least the mid-1990s in particular to push those same truths of the way of the world as have served the logic of neoliberalism. Capitalism is so naturalized in a school of design, these are conversations that don't happen there. So to bring this a bit more into the present, did not know the G&D was getting reintroduced yesterday, so lovely surprise to see on the plane. But I'm going to talk about how some of this sort of feeds into that bit of work as well. So for better and for worse, I honestly don't really care what we call these things. I care more about a shared vision, shared values, shared goals than I do shared branding. But if we're going to keep calling it the Green New Deal for a while, that's fine with me. The program itself is interesting for a few reasons. One is that it's wholly unique in America. It's the first to actually try to fuse these three pillars together into a coherent program. Does it imperfectly, does it in ways that reproduce forms of neocolonialism and green imperialism, but that's work that's been addressed over the last few years in some interesting ways. It's also unique in that it's the only plan ever put forward in this country that's actually indexed to the latest climate science. The closest we got before this was Waxman-Markey. That would have taken us to about 4.5 degrees of warming with no job creation if it was fully implemented in its most ambitious form. Also carries with it a ton of sort of agenda items for designers. I'm not going to read through all of these, but the idea that the G&D would require us to remediate every single hazardous or polluted site in the U.S., incredibly exciting as a single plank. It's one of many that are in there. And because they've chosen, the Green New Dealers have chosen the New Deal as their kind of central example, I lost my mic. I'm also going to spend just a minute on it. And I always like to do that beginning with this slide because there are some familiar posters and then some really insane ones, including a former public health campaign around STIs and dinosaurs that I had to see, so now you do too. Green New Dealers tend to think about the New Deal in relation to the Green New Deal as an analog. And this set of overlapping crises, their own ecological crisis being the Dust Bowl and the forced migration of 3.5 million people from the Great Plains to the West, their own sort of economic crisis with 25% unemployment and breadlines, and their own political crisis with the rise of fascism around the world, all of which they can find echoes of in sort of today's contemporary politics. And when designers tend to engage with the New Deal, it tends to be through the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Looking at the Norris Dam here, one of the first pieces of multifunctional infrastructure built in the US, helped power the South, also was imagined as a spectacle to be visited by folks from all over the world. And architects love to talk about this because they ran the TVA, among other reasons, when we love nothing more than self-mythology in architecture. But also, in some ways, was very successful. Becomes the second most visited collection of public lands in the post-war period after the National Mall. But often doesn't acknowledge the ways that the New Deal actually operated, right? It was not a massive sort of federal top-down effort. It was actually a transfer of funds from the federal government to state and local government for implementation. Most of the sort of public works production infrastructure we think of as part of city and county and state life now comes to us via the New Deal. And it means that it just simply reproduced power where it found it. So in places like Minneapolis, run by sewer socialists, it meant they got to lengthen and strengthen their coalitions. In places like the rural South, it meant that Jim Crow Dixiecrats got to do the same. So Brent Siebel's work, again, here documents some of this. I won't go through a ton of it. One of the other things the TVA gives us is after World War II, is this massive geopolitical project of control and domination, much like the Dutch water engineering sort of export that's underway now. So one of the sort of, our colleague Kian Go, who's not here, has an incredible book called Form and Flow that gets into this. But one of the sort of central aims of the Dutch government at the moment is to use their water engineering expertise to float their economy for the rest of their national sort of existence. They have no other real sort of plan for what to do. So that's why you see them working in the US, Indonesia, Japan, all over the world, because it's their only real sort of economic base. And relying on these sort of histories of the built environment are problems for in lots of ways. One of those is they just overlooked the 120,000 other projects we built. They weren't all heroic works of infrastructure. Most were really quotidian bits of sanitary sewer infrastructure, public housing, public schools, state parks. Phoebe Cutler has an incredible book that catalogs much of this for landscape architects, but there's so much more to get into there. I won't talk a ton about these, but the Rural Electrification Administration, on the left there, funds and builds about 380,000 miles of transmission line over the course of the New Deal. That's 42% of all the line ever built in the history of the country. The Civil Aeronautics Authority on the right funds and builds $1 trillion worth of civil aeronautics airport infrastructure, which includes places like Midway, but also these weird little arrows in the ground that you had to look out the window to make sure you were flying in the right direction for. And some of that, so to bring this into the present a little bit more, I've already talked about this project. There's a bit more internationalism work now that we're doing around some of these questions in the center, one of which is this field notes project I referenced earlier. I'm not going to talk about the deforestation bit because we've heard a lot about the sort of challenges natural climate solutions pose, but I'm going to start to wrap us up here with just a couple of things from some student studio work over the last couple of years. Some of which began with a very different but similarly themed event in 2019. This is actually the first time I met Neil, who was shepherding I don't know how many students from the GSD down to come hang out with us for the day. You're in the top left there if you can't tell, Neil. I can't tell if we're in like a pick or a scratch situation there, but yeah, just very thoughtful, very pensive. But this event led to all sorts of things for us in the center, collaborations, projects, et cetera. Including this now sort of incredible luxury I've had to have 5 years to really map out an advanced studio sequence with interdisciplinary graduate students around questions of what it might mean to actually build the G&D. The first version of that, I asked students to sort of work through a set of questions of priority. Who belongs at the front of the line and who does not, and for what reasons? They could have answered that in many ways, but they chose 3 regions, Appalachia, the Mississippi Delta, and the Corn Belt. I think they chose pretty well. And the second version took them back to central Appalachia, this is eastern Kentucky, to work through questions of sort of decarceration and climate justice. How do those things meet on these abandoned mine lands that have been transformed into carceral facilities? If you don't know, the second most common use for an abandoned mine in Appalachia is a prison facility. That's after remaining abandoned. The reasons for that are that they're flat mountaintop removal sites, so the only sites left to build on. A second is that there are state and federal funds specifically to build those facilities there. And the third is you don't have to remediate them if you want to put incarcerated people on top of them. So I had students working through a range of things, including converting those into rural electric co-ops. They're already on smart grids or islanded grids, microgrids, so they can immediately sort of be transformed in that way if we were to combine decarceration and climate justice in a single agenda. In the third version, had them back in the Delta for a plantation to prison pipeline sort of set of investigations. Won't go through all of that as well, but doing things like pulling archival data to figure out which cotton and sugar plantations had been converted to fossil fuel facilities or carceral facilities, going through the built environment of a place like Thibodaux in southwest Louisiana to get a sense of how much of the built environment was literally produced or specced with materials made by incarcerated people. And then just in the final version, using this bit of sort of work from the Field Notes project, this is a map of all the active and speculative rare earth element and critical mineral and transition metal mines in the world. Took students to South Greenland with the incredible amount of help from Zane Griffin Talley Cooper and lots of other people who've been involved in this project over the years, which is the second densest collection of rare earth elements and critical minerals in the world. They're located there. It's a site of, it was an incredibly strategically important site to the nuclear weapons and energy programs of the US and Europe in the 60s and 70s. It was closed in the 90s due to decades of activism by a group called Uranium, which means uranium no thanks in Greenlandic, and is now being proposed for reopening by a company based in Australia. One of their arguments as they sue Greenlanders in Danish court is that there's no excess ambient radiation here from extant uranium mining. We took Geiger counters there. We were the first people who don't work for Greenland Minerals to bring Geigers to the region, so we left them behind. And found Fukushima level radiation throughout most of the region. And I won't talk too much about this. This is a glacial rock flower slide. If anybody really wants to talk about like very nutrient dense soil amendments coming out of ice sheet melting, we can talk about that. I won't talk about this because Holly did either, or Holly did too. I'll just end by saying, this is when I start to think about where all these things come together. This is my own little mental map of like, how do I talk about my research with people? Where the fuck are these places? And so, thinking about where these things and how they're connected to each other, coalfield to prison pipeline production, plantation to prison pipeline production, and the various rare earth frontiers you see kind of represented here all get sort of stitched together for me in this sort of like geospatial arrangement. So with that, I will finally stop talking. So thank you, Neil.
So first of all, Billy, for me, that was completely urban, but we can talk about that later, maybe.
I was hoping to provoke that from you. So,
you got it.
yeah.
Thank you all very much indeed. We have about 30 minutes left, and what I would propose is to do 2 rounds. And I would ask that if you could try to be pretty concise, either with your reflection or your question. And I would urge our panelists just to jot down some notes. After round 1 and 2, we'll turn it over to the panel to respond. But we'd really like to get lots of voices into this conversation. There's a lot on the table. And we've got Sabina and Nina with mics. So please just wait until they come to you so that we can make sure we get you recorded. And again, just a reminder to please kindly identify yourself so that we know who you are. The floor is open. Who wants to start? Mernouche.
Hi, I'm Mernouche. I'm an archaeology faculty. So I'm reflecting on a few threads of talks. So in the history of urbanization, as archaeologists define it, a specialization is the core of socio-political complexity. And I find different threads here that a lot of these issues, from the power lands to fuel to farming that we discussed, are all caused by this specialization, where each group is doing one thing and the flows needs to go globally. So I wonder if basically that is counter-affecting humanities, and we need to go back a little bit to despecialization and multifunctionalities.
Thank you very much. Someone on this side. Thank you.
Thanks. Hey, I'm Allison DeYoung. I'm a urban planner at the Water Institute based in Louisiana. Those were 3 incredible talks. So excited about all of that. My question is, we talked a lot about spatial arrangements and trying to understand how to incorporate new thinking about justice throughout all of this. But there's also, in addition to legacy infrastructure, there's legacy regulatory products like NEPA. And anytime we talk about reforming NEPA, there are a lot of people from dispossessed communities who are like, that's the only thing we have standing in the way of this stuff. So it came up last year with Manchin and everybody. I'm just wondering, and now there are executive orders intended to try and put new EJ criteria into these processes. So you have executive orders trying to build on this flawed thing that's slowing down the production and construction and destruction that we need. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how we can think about transforming the regulatory environment in addition to our landscapes.
Thank you so much. Anyone on this side? We'll just go from side to side. Anyone? Don't lose your chance. Okay, let's go back to this side. Doug.
Yeah. So this is Doug Spencer, as featured in Billy's presentation. Yeah. So just a kind of proposition, and apologies, it's a bit kind of conceptual, but it might be relevant for you to think about. Is that I think that one of the, in being an educator, one of the biggest kind of fallacies that I have to address is that there's always the assumption that capitalism is against nature, and therefore anything that we do to return us to nature and the land is somehow redeeming us from that, and a total lack of reflecting on the fact that the very concept of nature that the West has is produced by capitalism. And even when we're using terms like land, we have to remember that, I was reading Sylvia Wynter the other day, the black decolonial feminist thinker, and she's talking about how the very concept of land is produced by capitalism. Before that, it's earth, so land as property, which also then allows the concept of people as property as well. And for me, landscape is the kind of naturalization of land as property by making it a kind of aesthetic appearance. So it's just really a question about, to what extent do you think, if you really want to dig down into some of these things, do you need to start even kind of questioning the concept of land, landscape, and nature? Or are those kind of less urgent than some of the immediate practical problems?
Thank you, Doug Spencer. Should we do one more? Alan. Please.
Alan Rudy, Central Michigan University. I'll take your land and I'll raise you one, right? So alienation of land and labor, alienation of social reproduction and commodity production. What's in between? Public land, civic space, right? So it's fundamentally going to be regulated by the state. And what I loved about all three of them is you cannot do this stuff without talking about the state. And so as we think about energy and regulation and deregulation, this how we produce space, right, the urban and the rural, then fundamentally becomes a part of it. And little last one thing, do you speak with Dustin Mulvaney much?
Yes.
Okay. That's all I wanted.
We have a lot to work with already, so maybe we'll invite the panel to respond. We can just go from, as it were, my left to the right. I don't know if you'd like to start, Hillary?
Sure. Okay. This is hard because if I went last, I could just not say the things that other people said. So specialization is a problem, and do we need to go back? Yeah, I think absolutely. Billy is the person who taught me that there was once a federal land use planning agency in the United States during the New Deal. There no longer is, and those people also had like a range of expertise. There's a really interesting history that I've just started to like learn about the kind of relationship between agricultural, urban, and industrial policy. And I think we don't have that, and we need something like it. And I think Holly said yesterday, we need a framework for large-scale, long-term planning. Regulatory products, absolutely. I said, so this project is trying to be about people who are sort of trying to intervene, and so a lot of that happens at the level of sort of regulatory processes, as well as patterns of land ownership. So we were talking yesterday about checkerboard land, some of us. So like, for example, one of the reasons transmission lines go in more remote areas is because there is no checkerboard land there. And so if we had somebody doing the work of piecing those parcels together, we could be putting them along highways, for example. But yeah, lots to say about the NEPA process that I think comes down to we should not end it, but we should better fund the BLM and help these processes function better. And all of my work is about how concepts of nature are produced by capitalism. This is very early in a project, so like language like landscape, I certainly meant it in a descriptive sense. But I think, yes, it's totally true. And also concepts like commons, which are themselves also coming from the same kind of Euro-American tradition and are not used by indigenous communities in the US and Canada. So another site for this book is looking at the development of co-stewardship arrangements in southern Utah mostly, but where tribes have been working with the US federal government to try to describe these places in different ways and steward them differently. So, yeah.
Ihnji.
Yes. Yeah, I'm not American, so I don't know if I can respond to specifically in American context. So I guess one thing about regulatory environment, I think that's really important because, like I said, the problem of waste and seagulls and things like that, that's because of this industrial land use zoning that has been mandated by the state, and it's really hard to change once that's established. In the early 50s and 60s, they couldn't really change it up until now. So it's really challenging to change the industrial land use zoning once that's settled, and especially because Australia is English-speaking country, but at the same time it's located in Asia, and there are a lot of Asian migrants there. And so it's really challenging environment to talk about planning and how English is used as a medium, but that's really not really the mainstream language in that context. So what is regulation, what kind of language we use to define regulation, that's really important. And I think the concept of land and landscape, like challenging the concept, I think that's what I'm really interested in too, because in this paper about the seagulls, I kind of talk about what is valuable is actually the interaction between different things. So for the people who see the seagulls as the God's creatures, their interaction with the seagulls in a specific time and place and kind of the temporal time frame, that defines what's valuable, whereas the property owners who has the properties and they think about time frame in terms terms of the degradation of their property values, or the devaluation of their property values and things like that, and that's how they perceive their value. So what is valuable is really the interaction between different elements, and therefore we really need to challenge some sort of land foundationalism that we often talk about when we try to locate the core of our kind of struggle or solidarity, because it is really relational how we define what's valuable.
Thank you. Billy.
Yeah, these are great questions, and I'm going to try not to repeat everything you all said. So for the first question, or one of the first questions around sort of permitting reform, NEPA, so on, one of the biggest frustrations for me in that conversation has been the very successful push from the center-right to make this all about creating a new deregulatory sort of environment, right? That the problem is not one of state capacity or administrative capacity or project management or so on, that it's one of sort of ill-conceived regulations for contemporary life. And there's probably a little bit of truth to that. We haven't done a ton of updating of those over the years. But study after study has shown the central challenge is not regulatory, it's administrative capacity, that we pre-Trump staffed most of our federal government at 1986 or 87 levels. We had a mass exodus of civil servants during the Trump administration. I haven't seen any new calculations for that, but my guess is they're basically in the environmental state, like back to where they were when NEPA was created in 70 or 71, pretty close anyway. And one of the things we get asked to do sometimes with Climate and Community Project is to write internal memos for campaigns, or in this case, for a transition team for the Biden administration. And the first memo we chose to write when we were asked to do something was basically the greenest thing you can do from your perch in the EOP is just staff the regulatory state of environmental review. That obviously wasn't heard super well, but that was the first thing we were asked to do. So that's one way. And then we could talk about the Army Corps of Engineers too, right? Which is not as connected to the energy system, but every piece of water and climate and coastal adaptation infrastructure we build for the next century is going to run through the Army Corps, for better and for worse, mostly worse. And they have their own set of challenges, right, that are related to this, that are outside of NEPA. They have this self-imposed set of reforms, the 3x3x3 reforms, where every project they build has to be complete in 3 years or less at a cost of $3 million or less. And initially in a 3-ring or 3-inch binder or smaller. Now it's a 3 gigabyte thumb drive. And as you can imagine, for a complex water engineering project, that means you have to build tiny, tiny, tiny segments of it as you go. And that means the cost balloon, it means the system doesn't work as it's intended until the very end, and it pisses people off the whole time because they're spending tons of money on infrastructure that doesn't do what they were told it was going to do. That's not even getting into the cap on new starts for the Army Corps of Engineers, which prevents them from building at the scale that we need them to build at. There's a self-imposed limit of 25 new starts that they can take on a year. Lots more I could say about that. I don't want to get too into, Doug, we can talk about, capitalism and landscape over drinks some more. But I think, when I think about this stuff, one, I think there's an incredible book from Luis Mazingo, Pastoral Capitalism, which is maybe the only book from a landscape architect that's actually engaging with this question ever written. It's not a field that has a particularly strong connection to that body of work. And it's because so much of this stuff is considered outside the boundary of our field by folks who run the fields, right? That this obsession with our faux origin story of Frederick Law Olmsted and Central Park and professionalization has so ingrained itself in designers' brains that they can't imagine a way to exist outside of licensure, outside of professional credentials, and outside of all of these Western institutions. And among the many problems that creates is that we don't get to acknowledge and recognize and count all of the work done by non-credentialed landscape architects and architects around the world, much of which we've seen in other people's presentations today. People who are building landscape projects that if we just strip the author name away, we would recognize as landscape architecture projects. And then for the state-led transformation question, I won't say too much other than there's a really interesting split right between the US and European examples after World War II, in which they used their version of the New Deal to pull things out of commodity markets like water and housing and energy, not perfectly and not evenly, but they at least tried. In the US, we used them to create new markets for those things. This is what the Tennessee Valley Authority did for rural appliance manufacturers, among other people. And Brent Siebel, who I mentioned, is a historian of liberalism generally, but of the New Deal, also has an incredible article which was just a one-off thing he wrote for some reason on the history of the Clinton-era industrial policy that was proposed and never came into being. It was this idea to set up basically state industrial policy hubs in all 50 states that would collect, commission, collect, and distribute, like an extension office, the latest, greatest energy, biotech, other forms of publicly funded innovation. And it was immediately sniffed out and killed by Gingrich when he became Speaker of the House, because he recognized it would be the end of the Republican Party in the US if they were able to push that through. So anyway, there's a whole other body of work there that's super interesting to dig into.
Thank you, Billy. We have time for another round of questions. The floor is open. Who wants to start? I can see it in your faces. Thank you very much. Go for it.
I just have a question regarding the city's exploitation of the western part of the U.S. Thinking that tangibly, the only thing that I could think of would be degrowth of the U.S. cities. Is there another alternative that makes sense in your mind, or how do you kind of operationalize that? Either not exploiting the western part of the country, or is it, or degrowth, or is there a third alternative process?
Thank you. Anyone on this side?
Thank you. I'm Santiago, and I'm going to share a question that actually keeps me up at night. I come from the design disciplines, urbanism, architecture. And if you could speak a little bit about these questions of scale, and especially temporally, because in a way, what you showed today is a very ambitious set of, let's say, visions, projects, that are really needed in order to understand what's going to happen in the future, especially you, Billy. But what it's really needed to make all of this possible is this new sets of social relations that will operate all of these projects once they are in place. All these 120 New Deal projects that you show, they will have new social relations in place. And I think that will fundamentally transform urban living in a way, no? So we've seen a lot about spatial scale and what's needed, but if you could talk a little bit about the temporal scale and what commitments are we facing as a society, no?
Thank you very much. Back to this side. All right, I'm going to throw one more in then. Last chance before I do. Was there a hand? Please. And then Xiaowei.
Hello. Derek from University of Illinois, Chicago. I feel like a lot of what's being described is a conversation around, and kind of to your point, changing the social contract. And I'm wondering how to begin the conversation to renegotiate it, especially when you have dispossessed communities and communities who kind of depend on the current, they're basically depending on the current social contract to try to survive. You could look at the refugees and immigrants in suburban Melbourne, or people who are building houses in flood zones in suburban Chicago to afford housing. So.
Thank you for that. And I think Xiaowei had their hand up.
I think building on that previous question, I'm curious about the image that you had of the No Big Solar protest, and you mentioned how there's kind of this tension where those folks can't make that kind of explanation legible to urban dwellers. And so I'm wondering, what would successfully making that legible look like, and what's at stake in terms of forming that solidarity? Is it some kind of united front of regulatory and policy change at the federal level, or is it some kind of political economic intervention?
Thank you for that. Anyone else on this side before we go back to the panel? Joe.
Just one want to ask another version of the question about the speculative. We've heard about projects here where your labs are creating policy documents for the Biden administration, and you're giving us fine-grained information. I suppose I'm talking mostly about Billy's project.
You're staring at me, I figured, yeah.
I'm staring at everybody. But fine-grained information about district by district where the prisons are happening. So I think, of all of the energizing, amazing projects so far, in a way, it's the ones on this panel that we've heard the most about data that could be taken up by local communities. And I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit more. I mean, is it just like politicians who are able to take your data and run with it, or have you had instances of journalists, local communities? And so that is a question for the rest of you, Ihnji and Hillary as well. Have you had journalists, other communities take your data, your stories, your information, and apply them? And if so, where?
Thank you very much. Billy, do you want to start this round?
Sure. I may not answer all of them. I'll just go to like a couple of these questions, but I'll kind of go backwards. So I think the first question from Joe here is one I think about a lot. One of the luxuries of having like enough runway to plan 5 years worth of courses, which is not something most people get to do, is for me in a studio, one of the things, it's a problem-based environment. Studios are doing very applied things. I think about those as trust and relationship building vehicles. Like the end result could be like useful, could not be, but it's about, for me, like finding a way to figure out how to be useful as like a scholar, as someone who sits in a center with real resources and power, to make our work useful to the CJ movement we work with. Some of those are national, international groups, some of those are local. And in the case of, let's just say, like the Appalachia Coalfield to Prison stuff, or Coalfield, to prison pipeline stuff, there's a half dozen groups that are not comprised of anyone who's elected to office that were part of that. I don't want to name them because I'll forget people, and also some of them don't want to be named. But they and lots of other folks in their kind of ecosystem consistently come back to that studio work and tell us they find it useful. So that's like always a nice little data point for us, and we can go in and track, because it's all on a website now, with some specificity, who's using it and where they are and that sort of thing. So that's also, I'm always surprised at like the long tail and usefulness of some of this work, and all the groups who we didn't bring into the studio projects who find it useful later on. I think I don't even remember what I wrote this note in response to, but there was a question that made me think about like the need to specify like the literal implementation of the energy transition. I was thinking about this with some of Holly's talk yesterday, but also because I was just in Raleigh, North Carolina, and because I'm a masochist, went to like a county commission meeting about the deployment of nearshore wind projects, just to see what that was like. And it's all the usual shit. It's people who are really upset, and not unjustifiably, about the way this is going to alter their view of the ocean or the coast or the Outer Banks in North Carolina, or whatever it might be. I think that's a silly reason to not build it, but also like I can understand why people feel that way. At that meeting, one of the ways that people were assured it would not be a problem was that the contractor was going to hire a landscape architect to provide a visual screen for them. So just like they're going to plant Italian cypress or some shit to like block that for them. And I guess that's like an answer to it, but probably not. We probably need to actually engage with the aesthetics of the energy transition. And if you think about where landscape architects were 20 years ago on stormwater management, which was just like, this is a thing that matters and civil engineers control it, we don't know what the fuck to do with it. They spent 25 years like trying to figure out ways to build up that technical expertise, and have been unevenly successful in doing so. That's where we are in terms of where designers are going to fit within the energy transition. There's lots of like high conceptual theoretical work that needs to be done, that I'm interested in, other people are interested in, but that like very concrete, like how do we actually make ourselves useful in the deployment of that infrastructure? Like we aren't there yet. We have a long way to go.
Thank you, Billy. Ihnji.
Yes, so for the social contract and the welfare, I think what's interesting is something that is good for certain people, somebody else is paying for it. And in the case of what I was trying to say, in my case was there's a very like beautiful places in Melbourne, and actually the production and production to make those spaces, and also the consumptions that are happening in those places, like who's paying for it. Obviously the areas that are defined as waste deserving communities. So it's the relational benefits of the things that are considered as good. And the other thing about speculation, it's not really answer to your question, but just made me think about speculation, speculativeness is the state has a particular vision of economic growth, and for them, like providing a good quality of life for the refugee settlements and etc. That's a really ideal like vision, and therefore growth is legitimized based on that. But actually, like it's very limited version of good life, and what is good life is is a really fundamental question. And so it's not just about like job and just like making a living, and the kind of mentality is very much constricting when we are thinking about other speculative futures. Yeah.
Thank you. Hillary.
I'm going to try to address the questions about social change, and you should all find me at the reception because there's so much. I have so many things that I'd like to say about them all. But I mean, I think in terms of what to do about the West, is there the option to not exploit? Is it degrowth? Is there some third option? Like, so there isn't, land has to be used. We have to decarbonize. Large scale energy is going to be part of that. So there's not some zero exploitation scenario that I can see. One of the people I work with always says, we have to decarbonize before we end capitalism. So, I mean, this is, which I think is right. I don't know if you'd all agree with me on that. But so, one level, I think there's the question of like the regulatory context, and especially the sort of staffing in state capacity questions, so where things could be done better. But for me, I think I've been really struck by the use of these lands by people in cities for all kinds of reasons, like I outlined, not just energy, but also recreation, also housing, also whatever, and the complete lack of awareness about that, even by people who are making energy policy and land use decisions. And so, I think I sort of said this at the end, trying to have a conversation about commons, trying to at least make people aware that large-scale land use decisions are being made, I think could help move us beyond a conversation where anybody who's trying to say, this is a poor choice, why don't we move it over here, or can we keep issues of degrowth on the table, just gets kind of brushed away as an NIMBY. And I mean, again, too much to be said about this, but I think in the US, like the polarized political context also makes it really hard in the sense that anyone who tries to critique renewable energy development, we tend to assume that they are Republican voters who don't like renewable energy, right? These people love solar. They all live in the desert with their solar panels. So anyway, yeah, so partly public discussion.
Thank you very much, Hillary. Thank you to the entire panel. Thanks to all of you for really fascinating discussion. Let's give our colleagues a round of applause.